Or maybe we'll cut off this much. That should be okay, right? There's not gonna be anything bad else. This should be fine. There we go. You know, this is just the meaning origin of notes. It's not like, oof, could definitely get the N word on screen if I'm not careful. There's a lot of N words in this list. I'm really risking it all just by doing this, aren't I? Maybe what I'll do is I'll make it even smaller. Like, it can't hurt me in this small of a frame, right? Oh, look how excited you are. Got all the happy emotes coming out. People are dancing and jumping. This one's gonna be wild. I get to answer the age-old question, one that has plagued mankind since the beginning of mankind, and that is the G-Slur and the use of the G-Slur. I'm going to explain both what the G-Slur is, the historical context behind it, and is the use of slurs appropriate by anyone at any time for anything. All these questions will be answered and more, and you'll be able to cancel me, because I think effectively by even talking about this, I'll piss everyone off. There's no good outcome here. There's no Lance comes out on top. There's only some slight educational material. Oh, and we're also going to delve into critical race theory. You may have heard of it. It's the thing that Republicans absolutely despise, despite the fact that they don't know what it is. I'm going to explain a little bit of what it is and how it operates and works, and hopefully that will add some context to all this. But before anything, we have to ground our moral axioms. Of course, that's the start of any of these procedures. And I'm going to explain to you about the G-Slur. The G-Slur being gusano. What exactly is it? Now, it literally translates to worm, or I believe larvae in Spanish. It was a slur coined by Fidel Castro himself. That's right, there's not too many slurs that were started by revolutionaries, but this happens to be one of them. And it's in the context of that, of course, directed usually at the bourgeois Cubans, those who would flee the country rather than face the persecution of the revolution and or join the revolution and become class traitors. They fled to Florida, mostly, at which point they become lifelong Republicans for the end of their days. That is exactly what the slur itself refers to, but I'm going to get a little bit into the history of that and why some of that connotations are important in what we're about to discuss here. And also, we're going to explain a little bit about the history of slurs themselves. All sounds fun, right? There's not anything wrong. Now, you may have noticed I have on the screen my first moral axiom grinder, which is going to be Wikipedia. I'm going to go down the long list of ethnic slurs. Because this is obviously going to get me completely firebombed in terms of TOS, I'm going to do a thing which I don't often do, and that is I'm just going to have to censor myself a wee bit. You'll have to forgive me on this one, but it's necessary for the good of the stream. We're just going to cut off the left side. Or maybe we'll cut off this much. That should be okay, right? There's not gonna be anything bad else. This should be fine. There we go. You know, this is just the meaning origin of notes. It's not like, oof, could definitely get the N word on screen if I'm not careful. There's a lot of N words in this list. I'm really risking it all just by doing this, aren't I? Maybe what I'll do is I'll make it even smaller. Like, it can't hurt me in this small of a frame, right? Okay, let's scroll down for a little bit till we see whether or not it appears. There's some really, okay, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. It seems like bad words are popping up already, and scroll down because to answer the first question, is gusano a slur? We have to see whether or not it appears on the big list of ethnic slurs. And it does. It qualifies. The actual Wikipedia definition of this word is coined by Fidel Castro, presenting them as unsavory dregs of capitalist society that exploited the nation. Unsavory dregs of capitalist society that had exploited the nation. The official Wikipedia.com definition of this. Of course, on my screen right now, there's an overwhelming amount of other ethnic slurs appearing on the screen, but it typically referring to a person who fled the Cuban Revolution is the short version. All right, so now if I take that off the screen, I can make the screen large again. Oh, there we go, and we have something even more disgusting on screen. Fulgencio Batista. The bad Batista. If you haven't heard about him, well, he's a really big piece of shit. And I want to quickly explain something, just so everyone understands the history of the Cuban Revolution itself. The US, and you may have heard this already, maybe if you're in leftist circles, has a long history of propping up dictators in different parts of the world. Dictators that are usually very good US allies. Dictators that allow them, in essence, to exploit the countries that they're hoping the dictator will control. In the case of Cuba, Batista is the US-backed dictator that ruled for a while. And I believe I just want to get the right dates here. 1952 to 1959. That's quite a long tenure. Batista did what most dictators do, and that is to align themselves with the rich landowning elites. In this case, they happen to be the plantation owners. Cuba has always been very, very rich in sugarcane specifically. And because of that, Batista aligned himself with these rich plantation owners who, of course, exploited the people in order to get the vast amounts of sugar, which were then sold both to the United States and other countries at discounted prices to enrich and benefit the elites, to enrich and benefit the dictator himself. And that was basically just the way. Those who would be opposed to this, who would try to become dissidents, were caged or jailed. Anyone who tried to report on this was caged and or jailed. This was all at a time too when the US was pretty used to exploiting Cuba as a country. The American mafia, for example, had put up a huge amount of casinos and other things in Havana, for example, where they were regularly sexually exploiting people who were native to the area. And that was just the way. Until, of course, the Cuban Revolution came along, and due to the work of both Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, they took the country back and started a revolution of the people, which effectively took it away from the hands of the dictator. Now, those who owned the rich plantations at the time, well, many of them, rather than face either persecution for their behavior under the dictatorship and or align themselves with the revolution, they decided to flee the country itself, and they fled the country in large part to Florida. Which is why to this day there's a very large contingent of Cubans or ex-Cuban exiles or their children who vote Republican in Florida, and those people are often referred to in the pejorative as gusanos. They were referred to as gusanos during the Cuban Revolution itself, and the slang is still used to this day. That's a quick little history lesson on what exactly happened there. Oh, maybe we can get Vox to explain it even more. Let's get some liberal history lessons, everybody.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain for itself, or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. But at this point, in 1898, that fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906, 1917. Each time, the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. Today, when Americans think about the U.S. and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era. And that era technically ends in 1933 with an uprising against Cuba's government. Under U.S. law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality. And over the next 20 years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the U.S. That changes in 1952, when a former president and military leader named Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a coup, suspends the Constitution, and imposes an increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins the next year, led by a young Fidel Castro. American politics at this point is obsessed with fears of communism, so the
Now, I'm going to say it's obviously very reductionist for me to explain simply that the American empire was exploiting Cuba, and then after Fidel Castro came in, ended the dictatorship, and then everything became wonderful, peachy, and keen. That's not true either. One of the big problems I have with revolutionary figures, especially people who venerate them as gods or deities or something like that, often, usually, sometimes in history, as it is seen to be the case, end up imposing their own form of authoritarian, not dictatorships, but rule, shall we say. I mean, they usually hover somewhere in between the two, which can be, of course, time and time again, maybe repressive to certain groups or peoples. In the case of Fidel Castro's Cuba, yes, there's no question that it is incredibly repressive to people who are members of the LGBTQ community, for example. That is all true as well. It's not directly pertinent to the idea that the U.S. was effectively exploiting Cuba and utilizing a dictatorship for their own gain, and then a revolution ended up taking that down. That's also, like, both things can be true simultaneously.
Batista in the war, no matter how brutal he becomes. For Americans, this feels like a front in the struggle against communism. But for Cubans, it feels like Batista is an extension of American imperialism, and the guerrilla war a continuation of their long fight for freedom. Now, the communists win in 1959 and Castro takes power. The US, fearing communism's expansion, sets up the embargo to strangle Cuba's economy, tries to assassinate Castro, and even, in the disaster known as Bay of Pigs, sends in CIA-trained Cubans to try to take over the island. Castro turns to the Soviets for help, and in 1962 they nearly start World War III when the US blocks Soviet efforts to put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
That is true.
Now, the incident scares everyone enough
very
that
close.
Things settle into a tense but basically peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans are squeezed between the US embargo and Castro's dictatorship. In 1980, Castro tries to relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrive in Florida. No one realizes it at the time, but this adds a completely new dimension to the conflict. It's now also about the internal Cuban battle between Castro versus Cuban dissidents, which plays out through American politics. Now, this becomes really important in the 1990s.
Oh, I know that sound.
After the Soviet Union collapses, President Bill Clinton, seeing Cuba poses no threat, wants to end the conflict. And so does Castro, who can't count on Soviet aid anymore. But Cubans in America, who suffered terribly at Castro's hand, want to see him fall and push for keeping the embargo. In the middle of this fight, in 1996, Cuba shoots down 2 private planes chartered by Cuban-American activists. There's a big backlash in the US, and Clinton backs down. 20 years later, President Barack Obama tries again to end the conflict. By now, Americans don't really support the embargo. Lots of Cuban Americans are now economic migrants rather than political exiles, so they want openness. Fidel is getting old, and in 2008 hands power to his brother Raul, who knows the country needs to change. The US and Cuba start secret talks in 2013. The new Pope, Francis, helps negotiate. In 2014, they reveal their agreement to end the conflict, and the next year, Obama becomes the first president to visit since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. The US and Cuba have never really had normal relations until now, and that's crucial to understanding why it took so long for this to happen. So much has passed between the two countries over the past century, and the US has at times treated Cuba as more of a colony than it's a real country. It's a lot to get over, but it looks like they might both finally be ready.
When was this made? 2016. One day. Soon. Eventually. Yeah, everything in time, right? It's a flat circle. Don't worry. Nothing will change. Nothing to see here. And again, a couple quick notes. When it comes to the revolution of Fidel Castro, the revolution of Che Guevara, even the revolutions in Chile to topple the dictatorship there, most of them, the revolution in Venezuela as well, most of them are usually met with something that is very, very admirable, and that is an increase in the literacy rates of its citizens post-revolution, because that's something very, very big in most of these revolutionaries' minds, is they wanted to increase the literacy rates of the people. So an increase in the literacy rates, a decrease in infant mortality as well. In most of these revolutions, you'll see statistically. So they usually start out with an initial boon to the average person, an initial boon to the average citizen, and then as time goes on, unfortunately, they sometimes descend into authoritarian regimes in which the rulers will try to manipulate and change the actual constitution of the country in order to maintain and continue control. It's unfortunate because it's not as if there's a clear-cut example where you can say, well, this revolution X resulted in this incredibly utopian society. It's going to be very difficult to achieve that, even ones that have very positive and net beneficial programs for the populace, such as, strong social programs. There's a lot of shitting on Cuba consistently from American media. Well, at the same time, there's something to be said about the Cuban medical system, for example. There's a lot of shitting on Cuban, vehicles, and the fact that they're somehow stuck in like the 1950s. And if you go to Havana, why do all the cars have these old models and stuff? And why do their stores and magazines only sell a handful of products compared to the bounty of American capitalism? And the answer to that would also be there's a huge set of embargoes imposed upon the country itself, which has prevented and limited the amount of trade that it can have throughout its history. A lot of its cars happen to be old Soviet era cars. Oh, someone in China is catching up to that. Yeah, that's one of the aspects as well. Anyways, I'm going way off topic because we're talking way too much about Cuba when we should be talking about the internet, because that's what everyone technically cares about. And slurs, because slurs, they are a varied thing. Let's ground more axioms, everybody. Very simply put, an insulting or disparaging remark or innuendo, an aspersion, a shaming or degrading effect, a stain or a stigma, a blurred spot in printer matter, a smudge. This is the one that we probably won't concentrate too much on. Not going to be completely relevant for our purposes. But anyways, any insulting or disparaging remark, technically a slur. Now, that in and of itself isn't too bad. I'm sure that's something everyone can agree on. And there's obviously a scale. I'm sure everyone here can agree with the fact that not all slurs are created equal. Ethnic slurs, for example, tie in race and ethnicity to the insult itself. So not only are you insulting an individual, you're also insulting an individual based on a classification of race. Again, these are all social constructs. We as a society have invented language. We as a society have invented the concept of race, how we stratify people based on characteristics that we just perceive on the outside. None of it is real. It's all man-made, but we as a society have also determined what we consider to be slurs and what we consider to be bad slurs versus acceptable slurs, and not all slurs are created equal. This we know, for example, I can point out right now. Do you think it is more offensive to call someone a Karen or to call someone the N-word? Clearly, you can see the juxtaposition between the two of those. Now, there's a handful of reasons for that. One is we're going to talk about the stratification of power structures within society. That's very, very important as to how slurs are used. The second, and I know everyone's like, why the fuck are you getting so into your own head on this, Lance? This is just a very simple thing. Aren't slurs bad? The short answer to this is, of course, yes, they are. That's a very, very simple short answer to this. Slurs are bad. If you're trying to win a debate, if you're trying to win an argument, or if you're trying to even convince people, or if you're trying to even have a conversation with someone and you want things to remain civil, I would avoid the use of slurs altogether. That would be my personal advice. It's very, very simple. Yes, slurs are bad. It's a form of insulting someone else. We all use them. Everybody does. It doesn't matter whether you use them outwardly. It doesn't matter if you use the very, very bad ones, the ones in society are like, oh shit, no, those are beyond the pale. We don't accept those. If you call someone an idiot, if you call someone dumb, you are using a slur. People would like to expand upon that in the modern age and say that's using terms like idiot, dumb, stupid, moron, stuff like that, are also ableist, because you're implying then that having less than average intelligence is somehow a connotation to be vilified within society. So that has been added as well. Ableist slurs go much, much more harder. Obviously, we know about the R slur and how it's been used throughout history to both vilify and justify things like eugenics, which is why it's ever so horrible. Things like the F slur, for example, are very, very pertinent to the homosexual community as well as just the LGBTQ community in general, because of the horrible connotations that it had. Not only to be associated strictly with the idea that it was a stick, but it was a stick that was utilized to burn people who were considered to be evils in society, such as homosexuals. So that's why the term of the F slur is quite so strong and striking. So there's definitely a difference in slurs, how they're utilized, when they're utilized, and stuff of that nature. Anyways, the reason we're talking about all this is, of course, what occurred. I don't know when this originally occurred, but we have Destiny's quote-unquote friend. I'm probably going to drop that because I think we all are on the same page here. Destiny writing, I worry sometimes about the 2016 skeptards might have been correct about a few things. Sigh. And then it's the clip of Zotz.
Ours because I call Destiny a fucking gusano. Because he is. Oh, but he's Cuban. This motherfucker has blue eyes. Not that it necessarily matters, but I can definitely tell you that because I can definitely tell you that his family owned fucking a plantation. His family definitely owned fucking slaves. There's a big tell.
So this is the clip that went viral yesterday. I believe it went viral on live stream fails as where it first popped up, and then it started popping up all over the place. Here's one quick note. If you're trying to point out that this is an insulting slur that has hurt you, of which I think anyone has the ability to claim that about anything that they've been called, that's just on you. Everyone has that. Don't also use slurs in the call out, all right? The use of adding ards to the end of words is kind of, I don't know, the modern edgy way of trying to say you're getting away with the R slur. And it's not unique to Destiny. Everyone uses it. People on the left use it as well. I've heard libtards, you know, I've heard contards, just adding it to the end. But basically, it's a way of trying to sneak past the fact that most people at this point have kind of agreed that using the R slur openly is just not a great look. So it's basically one of the things that's being used, you know, pretty consistently. That being said, the use of gusano as a slur, I think the reason this is up for so much debate, which is unusual to me because I think it's pretty simply acceptable that, yeah, of course, this is a slur, but people will probably think by definition, because anything, again, can be a slur. If I called you mosh, like M-O-S-H, if I called someone mosh, in my head, it means the worst possible thing I can think of, but I start calling people mosh, and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy's a mosh head, he's just such a mosh, and it's really indicative because it really speaks to him and his mosh values. All of you would be like, what the fuck are you talking about, Lance? That has no weight, it has no gravity, it has no severity. We as a society don't use that word or even understand what it means. It's made up nonsense by you, Lance, right now, so there's absolutely no real implication, you know, there's no implication, and there's no weight or connotation behind it, and it's not me trying to oppress a certain demographic or people. It's utter and complete gibberish, whereas everyone inside the chat right now is saying that I've gone too far. You took it too far, Lance. You used the M slur, which again was pointed out. I guess the original tweet is gone now, but Kalia wrote something, I assume, I think it originally said, like, I'm completely comfortable with calling Destiny a gusano. And it says, I guess you feel safe using racial insults because you have so many buffs. You're basically invulnerable to online criticism. Nice. The joke here being that these are considered, I guess, RPG upgrades or something to that effect. Or maybe it's making fun of using neo-pronouns in the modern era. Again, you know, less than this is a slur. This is just insults. But they're hurling insults back and forth. And the question now comes, which ones are worse? Is it worse to use the slur gusano against someone who's partially Cuban as an insult? Is it worse to indicate that things like being non-binary or trans or being a person of color is considered a buff? For all of this, we have to go back to something known as critical race theory. And this is something, again, that is spoken about openly, frequently on the internet. I see critical race theory being thrown out all the time, mostly by conservatives who seem to think that it means that we should just eliminate white people as a whole, or that we should suddenly acknowledge that time is racist, or that we should suddenly, like, I've heard so many weird theories from everyone on the right. So yes, I'm sorry, it's time for a little sociology, everybody. We're going to explain quickly critical race theory. It's actually very simple. I mean, yes, if you want to read deep into it, there's a whole host of writing, and it's very, very fascinating stuff, but examine society and culture as they relate to the categorizations of race, law, and power. Argues social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than they are by individuals and psychological factors. Very, very simple. I don't think any of that is controversial, and I don't think most people, even people on the right, would necessarily disagree that there happens to be a huge influence that comes from societal structures that we as human beings have created. We create these societal structures, and it examines how different cultures and societies oppress and control one another, exert power, if you will. There's two main themes. And this is basically what most of critical race theory is trying to examine. That white supremacy exists and exhibits power maintained over time, and in particular, the law plays a role in this process. Number two, transforming the relationship between law and racial power, as well as achieving racial emancipation and anti-subordination, are possible. And I think I'm preaching to the converted where I say everyone here is probably on board with that, right? You would like to see racial emancipation. I would like to see eventually the end of it, as well as anti-subordination. These are possible, attainable things because we as a society have structured these things in such a way that we as a society could also undo them ultimately. Now, do they have a necessary layout for this plan? Is there a quick one to answer? No, of course. This is a hugely complicated, multifaceted issue. But now when we talk about white supremacy, and I know a lot of people hear that word, they think immediately of just the very narrow textbook definition, which would be that is an inherent belief that races are superior to one another and that your race, which in most cases happens to be the white race, is the superior race. That's the textbook definition that most people think of because we've just been exposed to people like the alt-righters, the neo-Nazis, historically, and that's what we think white supremacy is. In academia, white supremacy is actually a far more nuanced and interesting, to be frank, topic. It doesn't refer to self-conscious racism or the superiority of hate groups. It refers to the political and economic and cultural systems in which white people overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread. The relation of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Now, how does all of this work? Well, here's the wild thing. When you hear about the history, especially the history of capitalism and the entire economic system that we find ourselves in, it's very odd to me that a lot of times they will leave out things like the North Atlantic slave trade, because that is crucial. That is crucial for understanding our society as it is today, especially race relations within the United States and Canada as they are currently. We have an economic system, and this economic system, which is basically the dominant economic system globally, being used by most countries, even the ones that call themselves socialist with Chinese characteristics, are still utilizing capitalism as it is today. Capitalism and the basically grandeur and expansion of the Western dominated sphere came in large part due to the North Atlantic slave trade, an industry, a capitalist venture, if you will, that was based entirely on the subjugation of another race. In fact, it required the creation of a racial hierarchy. That's where we started to come up with the idea of races being superior to one another, because the white race would have to justify why the Spanish conquistadors, the Dutch conquistadors, the British conquistadors, every single one of them was enslaving vast amounts of people who came from Africa, different countries in Africa. So we invented racial hierarchies. We said that, yes, well, the white race is the superior race. It has been bestowed to us by God. We can find that evidence in the Bible, and because of that, we are actually doing God's chosen work. We are subjugating an entire people. We're treating them like property, like cattle. That's the reason it was called chattel slavery, and everything horrible that we do therein is basically done because there's a justification for this, a racial justification for this. This resulted in the overwhelming enrichment of individuals who happen to be white. Now, while the white race doesn't exist at all, these are just arbitrary connotations, historically, as this intergenerational value is passed down through and through more and more generations, and in the United States specifically, because there was so much done to basically, what's the word, hurt the, like, I wish I thought of a better verb than hurt, but basically inhibit black people from accruing wealth throughout history. Originally done when the end of slavery, for example, was over, there was supposed to be a large transfer of property over to previously black slaves. This was supposed to happen under Abraham Lincoln. He was unfortunately assassinated. This transfer of land never occurred. Then there, of course, was the imposition of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in the segregation of people in the United States, and also basically created two class systems that were divided between not only racial lines, but school lines, food lines, anything you wanted. There would be basically a two-tier system, an apartheid, if you will. This increased with the 13th Amendment, which of course required abolish slavery in itself, but it didn't abolish slavery if you happen to be a prisoner. And if you've got an entire justice system that is completely focused and unfairly disadvantaged, or going to be unfairly disadvantageous to the black population, it's going to result in them getting arrested more often. It's going to result in them getting charged more often. It's going to result in them getting convicted with worse sentences. It's going to result in more black people going to jail, and yet it's still completely legal for black people to get unpaid labor in prison. Then yes, you're going to continue and perpetuate these same cycles. This all being said, under the system we have now, which is the dominant economic system being capitalism, capital equals power. That's how the system works. So the richest individuals in the world are overwhelmingly white. The richest institutions are still dominated by white people. The most powerful country in the world is still America. They have the largest army in the world. The majority of politicians are white. The majority of CEOs are white. That's where the concepts of white supremacy come from. And if we live in a system, the current capitalist system that we have, if that system basically tells us that we have to make our own merit, it's a meritocratic system. So basically you will rise and fall based on your success within capitalism. So your ability to accrue wealth, to get a good job, a good house, 2.5 kids, a beautiful dog, nice car, all that kind of stuff is deeply intertwined into the idea of succeeding within capitalism. And we have a system that values those who have more capital. Then the idea of white supremacy is ingrained into the very fibers of our society. That's where it all comes from. So the idea being that we actually have something known as colorization in the world, whereas you will be more respected, you will have better advantages in life depending on how light or dark the color of your skin is. And it can actually be demonstrated and verified within job hiring rates, within pay scales, within a whole host of different reasons. This is so pernicious that it infects every single facet of our society. So all that being said, is the concept of slurs unique to this critical race theory? There's a lot of academia on the subject, and a lot of it is absolutely fascinating. Some of the ones that I want to pull up is by Mihaela Papawayat-Logos from the University of Barcelona, who wrote a great academic article called "Not All Slurs Are Equal." and slurs are typically defined as conveying contempt based on group membership. However, here I argue that they are not unitary group. First, I describe two dimensions of variation amongst derogatives: how targets are identified and how offensive the term is. This supports a typical definition of slurs as opposed to other derogatives. And then highlight the problems of this definition, mainly caused by variable offense across slur words. In process, I discuss how major theories of slurs can account for variable offense and conclude the contempt based on the group membership doesn't cover all the data. I finish by noting that the most offensive slurs are those that target oppressed groups. I claim it is the oppression that underpins most offense, and that beyond this offensive property, some slurs are actively used to oppress. That's the important part. Are slurs being used to oppress other people? Because the N-word historically was used to subjugate and oppress black people in the United States. So if someone is to tell you now Karen is suddenly a slur, that they want to introduce Karen as a slur because it directly targets white women, and I don't like the idea of white women being targeted solely on the fact that they happen to be white women. I feel that this is a racial slur. Well, at the end of the day, if you were to compare the severity of calling someone a Karen, which is essentially calling someone out for abusing their own privilege, right? Most of the time, these Karen compilations, when people are calling people Karens, it's individuals who are willing to phone the police on someone who is black solely on the fact that they are black in a neighborhood, things like that. Well, it's not exactly being used to oppress them. They are the ones doing the oppressing in this case, and it's an insulting pejorative being used specifically because of that phenomenon. Now, technically, are both slurs? Yes, no question. Like, even though it sounds ridiculous, they are, because by definition, just the word slur. I mean, this is just language. These are very, very simple semantics, right? At the end of the day, they're both, but one is being used by an oppressive class to oppress another group of people. The other is used to identify a group that may be oppressed, for example. I would read a lot of excerpts from this article. Unfortunately, it's riddled with racial slurs, of which I don't want to show on the stream. So if you're interested in this, it's free. It's very easy to find. It's called Not All Slurs Are Equal, and it'll go into detail and explain the severity and height and use of these slurs throughout both history and how they've been utilized. What was the final thing? Oh yeah, I wanted to pull up buffs. A term generically used to describe a positive status effect that affects mainly player or enemy statistics, usually a cast or a spell. Examples of buff include increase the movement of speed of the target, increase the attack speed. This is basically boomering out and being like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to actively define buffs for everybody, but now I'm gonna try my best. Now, one of the final things I want to say on this topic, because this is something that's coming up a lot, not just in Twitch, but the use of slurs and all our slurs, are they all created equal? Should everyone be using slurs? No, the answer to that is absolutely not. If someone thinks that all slurs are created equal, then you are basically empowering white supremacy and white supremacist structures, because there's something known as gallows humor. Humor that is uniquely to be done amongst people who are in the gallows, those who are being oppressed. For example, if there are slaves who are making jokes towards white people, towards their masters, and those jokes happen to have racial connotations to them, that is different than the masters who are oppressing them and then using the N-word to continuously vilify and oppress them as well, in order to also justify their oppression of the lower classes. That's why there's a big difference between the way slurs are used and how they're utilized by individuals. That's got to be a really important part of this. That being said, the other part of this entire argument is, should you be using slurs at all? Especially, should you be using them in online debates? Should you be using them to reference people? My answer to that would be also no. Simply for the fact that I think it lowers your ability to continue an argument, especially in an arena which is, let's be completely honest here, overwhelmingly white. And I mean that. Do you know something amazing I found out the other day? There's an individual named Black Red Guard. He is a Maoist, a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, probably what you would consider definitely a revolutionary. His Twitter account is filled with a whole bunch of stuff about how we need to prepare for the revolution, how we need to do so many things that would be considered to be very, very, powerful and too spicy for YouTube, too spicy for a lot of different groups and organizations. He did a poll the other day asking, I want to find out something. What is the ethnicity and race of my followers? Overwhelmingly white. 60%. 60% white. That is because in these online spaces, these online communities, these online political communities, the overwhelming majority of the people who are using online media to consume this kind of information, whether you want to admit it or not, happen to be white. So even in a community like Black Red Guards, it is an overwhelming amount of white people. That means that there's an opportunity here to educate white people, because I, for one, I'm not on board with the idea that there's an inherent problem with white people, because I don't believe that white people exist. They don't exist. I don't think black people exist. I think society stratifies and classifies people into these groups, and that's an unfortunate thing, because we actually have all these ingrained perceptions about entire classes of people based on this arbitrary thing that we've invented called race. But at the same time, the idea that there is going to be a biological difference between the races is been disproven time and time again. It's been disproven by numerous organizations that like the Human Genome Project that has cataloged the entirety of the human genome, could not find anything related to race as we as human beings know it. So that's why at the end of it they were like, yeah, race doesn't actually exist. There's no biological determinant that actually classifies race. What you think of as race is something that you were inventing as a society and grouping people into time and time again. So that being said, if the majority of these audiences happen to be white, this is a great opportunity to educate people on these topics. I think that's also a very beneficial thing, you know? People shouldn't have to be like, I'm sorry for being white. You know, I think people, if people are saying white pride or things like that, well, that's fucked up. You should stop that right away, because that's just weird, and it's used throughout history to justify the subjugation of other races. If you want to say you have Irish pride, if you want to say you have Scottish pride, if you want to say you have British pride, if you want to say you have French pride, any kind of pride, that's completely fine. That's a cultural thing, right? You're engaged in the culture of your people. If you want to say I have deep pride in that, that's a beautiful thing. That's completely fine and acceptable. But the idea of you having specifically, I want to have, you know, any kind of a white pride day or a master white race thing day, well then yeah, you're skirting a little bit into the alt-right of the internet. But I don't think people should be ashamed for how they were born. That's the polar opposite of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to make people proud of how they were born, no matter what it was, how it was, no matter what you are. At the end of the day, why can't villains like LA2 have combined pride parade? Oh, I don't know. Spanish pride ain't that base either. Well, let's remember, by the way, if we're going to be talking about people who happen to be Latin, right? The Spanish Empire was a horrible fucking empire. The Spanish Empire was fucking brutal. They were so heavily involved in the slave trade, and I don't know why, but they seem to get a pass a lot of the time. It's just like by virtue of being Spanish, a lot of people are like, oh, cool. So that means that you're very cultured, and that means you're really into fantastic music and wine and things like that. I was like, the Spanish Empire, the reason Latin people are so diverse is because the conquistadors who came over and absolutely decimated the indigenous populations of Central and South America, absolutely eviscerated them, both by a combination of bringing over diseases that they weren't resistant to, and actually just decimating them, both starving them, enslaving them, killing them, raping them, all over the place, and also, having sex with them. And that was one of the results, that we have so many different kinds of what appear to be races in Central and South America. It's a huge combination of, colonizers coming over and wreaking havoc and disaster upon the original indigenous peoples of those lands, and resulting in an incredibly vast array of different ethnicities. That's the reason you have people in Chile who can look perfectly white. You have people in Brazil who can look like a combination of being black and Japanese. It's because there is a huge mix of different racial combinations going on there. And it's one of the reasons why there's often people who use insults such as these to refer to different groups of people. I'm trying to, sorry if I'm stopping while I'm speaking. I'm trying to watch my words extremely carefully, because I know I'm speaking about things that are very, very controversial and also very cancelable. But that's one of the reasons. That's why people have such a hard time at times defining what it is to be Latine. Because it's a combination of so many different cultures, so many different ethnicities at the same time. Brazil, the Portuguese Empire. Yeah, I mean, Portugal, also a pass. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, I feel at times they get huge passes. The Dutch, oh man, do they ever get a pass. When it's at the end of the day, we always think of the British, right? And sometimes we think of the French, because the French colonies are still kind of wrecking their own particular havoc in African countries. But we often think of the British. It's the British. And don't get me wrong, the British were amongst the worst. There's no question about the British Empire being bad. But all the empires were bad. I can't think of a single good one. I can't think of a single fantastic, benevolent empire. They were all slave traders and horrible, to say the very least. Japan was fucking atrocious. Japan's not good. I wouldn't say that's a good thing. I'm not pro-Japanese empire.
If you want us to advertise your channel or work, please go to weareserfs.com and email us a 20 to 30 second ad, and we'll take it on to the end of one of our videos to help promote your leftist channel or progressive something. Whatever you do.
To our gods, Anra, Xander Corvus, Schlatsky, we look to the stars for your divine guidance. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are merely puppets for your amusement. To our lords, Trevor R., Alexander Thaler, Hans Josephine, Ryan Lubin, Timothy K. Meeble-Beeps Jr., Bisexual Black Gamer, and Tofox, we shall carry your banner into the fog of war. To our Knights of the Round Table, Josh Mickelson, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, Todd Lajeunesse, Political Puppy, Jimmy Bignuts, Andreas Chiringuito, Yoppie, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Thomas Barrington, J. Fraser Cartwright, Goofalankius, Melissa Murphy, Nicholas Marks, Radical Maniac, The Great Pudini, Kale Kotka, Anthropophagic, Serene 42, Chronic de Hemphog, Phone Jenny, Incosin, Constance Joyce Lacheris, and Ramon Acosta. We drink with you and we salute you.